Hi guys, welcome back to Hillside Homesteading. I'm Salisha. Today I wanted to show you guys how I make my go-to gluten-free sourdough bread. I did show you guys in the last video how I make my sourdough starter and how I get it nice and active and bubbly so it looks like this. Really active sourdough here, starter. And so today we're gonna show you how I make the bread. If you wanna double this recipe, you definitely can, but I still recommend having the recipe and baking it in two separate dishes because the baking time will increase if you double the recipe. In my last video, I told you guys sourdough bread is basically collecting wild yeast and making a ferment here. Like our starter is basically a flour ferment. And you're gonna feed the sourdough with flour and water every single day. You're gonna come and add a tablespoon of water, a tablespoon of flour, and you're just gonna feed that every single day. If it's a little too wet, add a little more flour and just mix that in and just keep it out at room temperature. If you find your sourdough starter is not active enough, feed it twice a day. Just leave about 6 hours in between feedings and you'll definitely notice your starter will start to be way more active. So I fed mine twice yesterday and then once right before bed. My starter is super active and it's ready to go into this bread. Sourdough is also really beneficial for people who have candida overgrowth. So if you're dealing with any sort of yeast problems, you might want to think about switching to sourdough because you're not adding all of that excess yeast. This yeast is wild yeast that's already around us, so it's not going to cause any sort of digestion upset. It's not going to cause bloating. It's not going to cause you to get skin rashes or eczema or anything like that. It's just much more beneficial for your overall health than it is to eat the store-bought yeast. And sourdough also has a nice tangy flavor, so it just adds a little more body depth and flavor to the bread. One last tip I wanted to give you about sourdough is that if you leave it to ferment for more than a couple of days before you make your bread, the starter is going to get a lot more strong and a lot more sour tasting. So when you put that in your bread, you might get a stronger sourdough flavor. So I usually try to only leave mine out for about 36 hours and then I use it and then I put it back. I feed it with the flour and the water and I put it back in my fridge until I'm ready for my next dough. I do like a light tasting bread. Okay, so let's get to it and let's start making this bread. So this sourdough bread is from the Celiac Association. It's from Beyond Celiac. This is how I make it perfect. So what we need for the recipe is half a cup of sourdough starter, half a cup from here. We're gonna need 1 large egg from your chickens, hopefully. You're also going to need 1 1/8 cups of your gluten-free flour, and you're also gonna need some xanthan gum, half a tablespoon of sugar, 1/4 teaspoon salt, and a tablespoon of olive oil. So let's start by getting the sugar, olive oil, and sourdough and salt in the bowl. Half a tablespoon of sugar. So this is my tablespoon, I'm just gonna do half. I add a tiny bit more sugar just because it gives it a little bit more flavor and it helps feed the sourdough a little bit, so it'll help activate that sourdough a little bit faster for you. 1/4 teaspoon of salt, 1 tablespoon and 1 teaspoon of your oil of choice. So it could be olive oil, coconut oil. You can use anything pretty much. So 1 tablespoon and about a teaspoon of your oil. Crack your egg, 1 egg. Two tablespoons plus 2 teaspoons of water. So 2 tablespoons and teaspoons. So 1, 2, and then 2 teaspoons. 1, 2. Now I'm just gonna give this a little mix together. You could mix this in your stand mixer or your KitchenAid, but the dough that I'm making is not that much and it barely reaches the dough hook for me, so I just use my hands and mix it together. So again, 1/2 cup of sourdough starter. So let's get my 1/2 cup here. The last thing is our gluten-free flour, and one last ingredient that I like to add in here is some xanthan gum. It's just, if you make gluten-free bread, you really need some extra xanthan gum. Even if your flour already has xanthan gum, I still think you need to add a little bit in there. This is the xanthan gum here, in case you've never seen it. This is what it looks like. 3/4 of a teaspoon of xanthan gum. We're gonna get the flour. So we need 1 cup and 1/8 of a cup of our gluten-free flour here. And I just have a mix of buckwheat, rice flour, tapioca starch, and some xanthan gum. So this is 1/2 cup. So I'm gonna need 2 of these to make 1 cup. That. And 1/8 of a cup. And the 1/8 of a cup. Okay. Give this a good mix. And give it a good mix. That's perfect. See, it's not that much dough once it all comes together. So if you're gonna double the recipe, I would still recommend that you bake it in 2 separate batches and follow the baking directions exactly as it says. Put it out on my counter and roll it around a little bit. Don't want it to stick at all. This is a very sticky dough, but I do want to knead it for like a minute or 2 at least. Okay, just keep it dusted. And then you can really knead that dough. And it shouldn't stick too hard because, again, I said if the sourdough starter that you're using is too wet, do a 50% hydration, which means you're just going to add 50% water to the flour. So you'll do 1/2 tablespoon of water and a full tablespoon of flour and feed it like that if it's too wet, and you'll get a nice thick sourdough starter, and that'll be perfect for making the bread just like this so that you can actually handle it and it won't be too sticky on you. So I'm just rolling. Okay, see now it's not even really sticking anymore. You can see how small this bread is. So it's gonna, you know, puff out to about almost twice the size, but it is a small dough. It's on the smaller side. Just double the recipe and then separate it in half and then bake them separate to make sure we get all that xanthan gum nice and distributed throughout the dough. Because the xanthan gum is really what's gonna give it that chewy texture. And so it's not too crumbly. And with the gluten-free bread, you're not building up gluten or anything. You're just really trying to establish a nice, smooth dough because there's no gluten in here. Okay. Just roll that like that, and I think that looks pretty good to me. All right, we're gonna get it back in the same bowl. All I'm doing is, you can dust it with a little flour or a little oil. I'm just gonna do a little bit of olive oil here. Just pour a little bit on my dough as well. Rub it around. Rub some oil in the bottom of the bowl so it doesn't stick, see? Okay, and now I'm just gonna take the dough and pop it in there. Okay, so now we have the dough ball in there in a nice greased bowl, and it's just gonna sit here for the next 6 to 8 hours. And you want it to stay here so that it rises. And in that rise time, you'll see it rise, and it'll get nice and springy and bouncy. And in about 8 hours, we're gonna take this, we're gonna cut it and score the bread, and then we'll pop it in the oven. It's gonna bake at 500 degrees, which is a very hot oven, but you're gonna put the lid on and bake it for 500 degrees. Obviously, it's not gonna be in this. You're gonna put it in a baking dish. It's best if you put it in a nice deep baking dish so that you get a nice big rise. If you put it in a wider dish, it'll actually expand widthwise and you won't get a nice thick bread. So we're gonna put it in a smaller baking dish, and then we're gonna bake it with the lid at 500 degrees for 15 minutes. Then we're gonna remove the lid and you're gonna turn the heat down to 450, and then you're gonna bake that for an extra 40 minutes. So I'll see you back in 6 to 8 hours, and then we'll bake this bread. Okay guys, so it's been about 7 hours and my dough has been rising. It's time to put it in the oven. I have it preheated to 500 degrees. I have a pot here lined with parchment paper. We're gonna put the dough in there, put a lid on it, and we're gonna bake it in the oven for 15 minutes. Okay, so here's the dough now. You can see how much bigger it is, and it's risen quite a bit. I can hear it bubbling and it sounds really, really good. We're gonna gently transfer the dough into our baking dish here. I have a deep saucepan. It's just all metal, so it's oven safe. I lined it with some parchment so that the bread won't stick, and I'm gonna gently transfer it without moving the dough too much. I don't want it to deflate. So gently turning it out of my hands. You can see how puffy and airy that is now. I'm just gonna transfer it into here. The oven is already preheated to 500 degrees. So I'm gonna get my lid on here or some foil, and then I'll bake it for 15 minutes. But before we do that, we have to score the bread. There we go. Scored. You want to put a couple of tablespoons of water underneath the parchment, and that's going to create some steam, and you're going to get a nice chewy crust like that. So just a little bit of water underneath. And it's not touching the bread, it's just in between the parchment and the pan. Okay, so I'm going to get it in the oven. Okay guys, so I just took it out of the oven. It looks really good. Just gonna remove. This is what it looks like. Okay, just gonna let it cool on this rack, and then I'll come back in a couple of hours. You want to let this sit and just cool all the way down. You don't want to cut into it right now or it's going to be gummy and it just won't, the texture will be completely ruined. So just let it sit and cool completely down till it's room temperature, and then we'll slice into it. The bread is all done, so I'm just going to cut into it now to show you guys what it looks like. All right guys, well I hope you enjoy my gluten-free sourdough bread recipe. It contains only 5 ingredients. A lot of us eat way too much wheat nowadays. We're always wheat here, wheat there. Everything is wrapped in wheat or with wheat. So if you can reduce the amount of gluten and wheat you have in your diet, you will definitely benefit from that. So thank you guys for joining me. I hope you enjoy my recipe and I'll see you in the next one. Stay peaceful. Subscribe.